This is Unger 101, the politics of Roberto Mangabeira Unger. We turn to part 4, Unger's political program. In part 2, we established that Unger is working at the level of universal politics, questioning fundamental assumptions built into the current arrangement of society, and proposing his own alternative universal political framework. In part 3, we examined how Unger finds the current state of the left to be lost. Here in part 4, we will lay out Unger's political program for the left, and for all of society. A program of human empowerment by way of democratizing the market, deepening democracy, and equipping the individual. As we explained in part 3, Unger believes that the left's foundational aim of greater equality is misplaced. Yes, a life must grant people a modest prosperity and independence, and relief from the extremes of poverty, drudgery, and oppression. But this is not enough. Unger argues that in place of greater equality, the left should fight for bigness, the social conditions that allow ordinary men and women to live big lives. What does this mean? Here are 5 aspects of the bigness that Unger is talking about. First, to empower people to live big lives, we must acknowledge and equip individuals' constructive genius. The guiding impulse of this leftism is not redistributive attenuation of inequality and inclusion, Unger writes. It is the enhancement of the powers and the broadening of the opportunities enjoyed by ordinary men and women. The future, Unger continues, belongs to the political force that most credibly represents the cause of the constructive imagination, everyone's power to share in the permanent creation of the new. Whereas some leftists dream of everyone ending up all right in the end, Unger says that that is not enough. We must enable everyone to share in the construction of the world, rather than leaving this constructive power concentrated in the hands of advantaged elites. Second, we should acknowledge how greatly expanding access to creative construction is not just good for constructors, it is a fresh life for all of society. More problems will be solved because more people are working on them. Rigid social hierarchy will melt away as more people flex their constructive muscles. Because social hierarchy lessens, one won't have to choose between isolation from society and subjugation inside of the hierarchy. You can participate without being beholden to someone above you. Finally, with more constructive power, we will be able to engage with the world while also maintaining the capacity to resist and transcend the world. Third, we have to understand Unger's idea of the self and how it informs the need for bigness. Unger argues that there is a dominant strand in world religion that presents the self as transcendent over context. The idea that we are incapable of being contained within any limited mental or social structure. The idea that we cannot be captured in a single explanation, that no context, no description of us fully captures our true selves, that there is always more in us, in each of us individually as well as all of us collectively, than there can ever be in any social or cultural world that we build and inhabit. Because of this, because of our potential to always be bigger than the institutions that house us, we seek rebellion, transcendence over our contexts. Unger isn't alone in believing in this conception of the self. He is simply articulating strongly a version of society that embodies the popular romantic culture present around the world. This ascent towards the experience of self-making has played a central role in the Christian, romantic, and liberal background to our secular ideologies of emancipation. He writes, in popular romantic storylines, the protagonists both find and develop themselves by struggling against their social fate. Even when they fail to change the situation, they succeed in changing themselves. They discover that they have infinities inside themselves. They raise themselves up to a bigger life. They aren't so ordinary after all, not the hapless puppets they at first appeared to be. To Unger, a social arrangement that acknowledges this conception of the self is ideal. Thus, the optimal social arrangement would make rebellion, in the form of ongoing experimental remaking, a normal part of social life. No institutional or imaginative ordering of social life accommodates all our strivings. But, to Unger, the next best thing to such an all-inclusive order is the combination of experimental pluralism, many different potential orders present in society, with experimental self-correction, a bias to orders that are more easily open to revision. Fourth, we must see how faith in self-construction goes together with a faith in human solidarity. Self-construction, to Unger, depends on connection with one another. At the same time, connection threatens to entangle us in subjugation and rob us of our individuality. Unger's ideal society allows us to engage society without surrendering to it, to live together while deepening the experience of our own self-possession. We should organize society in a way that minimizes the tension between cooperation, working together, and innovation, disrupting the organization of society. Society should allow us to be insiders and outsiders, in the world but not of it, benefiting from the human need for cooperation but allowing for enough individuality to examine the world and transcend it. Fifth, and finally, we should understand how equality does indeed play a role in the Ungarian project of making humanity bigger. Unger says that equality should be an assumption and a prerequisite. Equality should be an assumption in the sense that we should assume all humans have the potential to be godlike, and consequently that our human divisions are shallow. Equality should be a prerequisite in the sense that economic and political inequality stymies the project of opportunity and bigness by entrenching privilege at the top and entrapping people in poverty at the bottom. Equality, in the latter sense, is an important means to the end of bigness. Given these 5 aspects of the project of bigness, what then are we looking for in a societal order? How do we know the one we're aspiring to is good? If no social order can provide a definitive home for the human spirit, can one order be better than another? Unger says yes. One order is better than another if it diminishes the amount of subjugation we must experience to have access to one another. One order is better than another if there is opportunity for revision, and more so if revision is routine, if there is not much difference between acting within the structure and passing judgment on it from the outside. One order is better than another if it shifts our lives from the repeatable, routine actions to the unrepeatable, the creation of the new. That's what Unger is aiming for as he crafts his program. Given this goal, what then are Unger's specific policy proposals? One can separate these proposals into 3 projects: the project to democratize the market, the project to deepen democracy, and the project to equip the individual. Let's start with that first project, democratizing the market. Unger starts his economic thinking with the premise that we need to change the market, not retrospectively humanize the effects of it. It is not enough to humanize the social world, Unger writes. It is necessary to change it. Under this humanizing regime, the economy runs its course, and some end up very rich, included, and powerful, while others end up very poor, excluded, and disempowered. To make up for this hierarchical inequality, minimalist social democrats put forth an after-the-fact band-aid, where some money is taken from the rich, included, and powerful, and given to the poor, excluded, and disempowered. To Unger, this humanization of the social world is not enough. The fight must come before the fact, taken inside the institutions of the economy. We must, to Unger, engage once again with the effort to reshape production and politics, the effort from which social democracy withdrew. We must do this by rooting a bias to greater equality and inclusion inside the organized logic of economic growth and technological innovation, by changing the institutions that made the world hierarchical in the first place. Thus, the question is not more or less taxes and benefits, or more government or more market, but rather, what types of market institutions should we encourage? Unger answers this question by putting forth a variety of policy proposals that aim to democratize both the supply side, the production of goods and services, and the demand side, the consumption of goods and services of the market. Let's start with supply side proposals. With his proposals for the production of goods and services, he has two goals. First, he wants to achieve innovation-friendly cooperation. Unger points out that progressives often find a tension between cooperation and innovation. New innovations, such as robotic automation of manufacturing, for example, threaten the established forms of productive cooperation, as machines come along and benefit some people and harm others, causing upheaval for real human beings. Likewise, some forms of cooperation, like rigid union contracts, threaten the established forms of innovation, for they slow down the application of new knowledge and decrease firm flexibility. Unger says that we should not come down on one side or the other. We need innovation, because in the end, we would rather have machines do repeatable robotic tasks, freeing humans to preserve their supreme resource, time, to do what humans do best, the non-repeatable, the non-formulaic, the creative. Henry Ford-style assembly line workers might have had to switch jobs due to automation over the past decades, but it's not clear that it was a net bad to get rid of such robotic, formulaic occupations. But Unger insists we still need cooperation and worker empowerment, so that technological progress does not continually rip us apart. To achieve innovation-friendly cooperation, Unger says that we must find a way, for the sake of workers, to build social inclusion and individual empowerment into the practical organization of the economy and the social logic of growth and innovation. Plus, for the sake of innovation, we need to lay the groundwork to quicken the application of new knowledge and embrace automating repeatable actions, so as to move human work to the unrepeatable. In short, we should not fight innovation, but we should build inclusion into it. Second, Unger supports proposals that move our economy past our current system of wage labor, where most work as employees for a wage, selling their labor to, as well as ceding control to, an employer, and towards a system where more people think, feel, and act more of the time as entrepreneurs in command of their own time, making a living through starting ventures and entering into cooperative partnerships. In these two spirits, towards innovation-friendly cooperation and away from wage labor, what are Unger's concrete supply-side proposals? Unger's first proposal to democratize the supply side of the economy is to initiate policies to broaden access to resources that help people start businesses. Unger writes that we should generalize the work of venture capital beyond the private venture capital industry by using the government to radically expand access to credit, technology, expertise, and markets, especially in favor of the multitude of small-scale would-be entrepreneurs who represent a vastly underutilized source of constructive initiative. Decentralized funds and support centers that are semi-governmental and semi-independent could realize this so as to identify and spread successful local practices and accelerate innovation. Such funds could receive equity in the companies they support so as to become self-sustaining. Unger also writes that we should spread the practices of the most cutting-edge industries to more industries and workplaces. He describes how many vanguard firms, such as those in Silicon Valley today, share certain innovative organizational structures. They blur the role between those who supervise and those who implement. They create teams that collectively learn and permanently innovate. They have lowered barriers between specialized roles at work, and there's a fluidity in the definition of roles. They move the focus of new effort to that which can't be repeated by machines. They combine and superimpose cooperation and competition. And there is a predisposition for groups inside such firms to reinterpret their group interests and identities. If you were to judge the economy by what you read in magazines about the spread of googly workplaces, you would think these qualities were in every workplace in America. But the fact remains that these vanguard practices are limited to a small set of industries and firms in the economy. Unger argues that we should work to spread them to more. Unger also asserts that we should broaden the array of ways the state coordinates with the market. To Unger, the idea that there is a zero-sum spectrum that pits the market economy against the command economy is wrong. First, there is no institutional form called the market economy. Market economies can assume institutional forms very different from those that have come to prevail in the North Atlantic world. Second, the choice between market and command doesn't address the real historical successes and failures of different economic systems in the 20th century. The economies that have succeeded are not those that were the most market-oriented, nor the most government-directed arrangements, but rather those that have been able to deploy a superior set of cooperative practices. Good cooperation has allowed them to move between institutional systems. They have utilized plasticity, a way of working together that is, to the greatest possible extent, hospitable to innovation, including innovation in the forms of cooperation itself. Thus, Unger argues that we should use the power of the state to create the conditions for the organization of more markets organized in more ways. There should be an array of distinct regimes of markets, property, and contract that are capable of coexisting experimentally within the same national and global economy. We should experiment with different types of private and social property, different ways of funding and sharing the stakes and productive resources, and different methods of bringing new ideas to market. Currently, there is a classical 19th century way a firm and a market works. An owner does whatever she wants at her own risk with the resources at her command. This is one way, but can't we imagine other ways alongside it? Unger gives two examples of alternatives. First, in the 19th century, the US government underwrote a system of cooperative competition among family farmers, forging instruments for risk management and opening access to resources and markets. Unger asks, what if we did the same for the industrial and service sectors? We could create organizations that screen and enhance credit, adapt advanced technology to more rudimentary conditions, give people access to continuing education while they have jobs, and reskill them when they are between jobs, provide instruments for the effective management of risk, and support networks of cooperative competition, enabling teams of technicians and entrepreneurs to pool resources and realize economies of scale and scope. Unger points to another example of a different cooperative regime between the government and the market: World War II. The war established the forced mobilization of national resources, the imposition of high tax rates, and a freewheeling coordination both among private firms and between the firms and the government. What happened? GDP nearly doubled in 4 years. Indeed, as Unger shows, it pays to create the conditions that allow us to experiment with the organization of more markets, organized in more ways. Unger pairs these supply-side proposals with ideas for the demand side of the economy, proposals dealing with income, labor, and consumption. First, Unger asserts that there needs to be higher returns to labor. If workers do not take in a higher share of profits, then the link between general prosperity and workers' prosperity is severed. We should have a system where a rising tide lifts all boats by ensuring workers share in company profits. Second, we need to rescue people from the informal and illegal economy. In the short term, we need to ensure that workers are protected, updating the 20th century union system, which presumes masses of workers can be found in one place, like a factory, to one that ensures workers are organized and represented even though they are not all located in the same place. A key part of this imperative is that well-organized unions represent the interests of the presently unorganized. In the long term, Unger, as stated above, hopes that economically dependent wage labor gives way to self-employment and cooperation, blurring the line between labor and management. Thirdly, Unger writes that we need to provide incentives and subsidies for the employment and training of the lowest wage and least skilled labor. To accomplish these supply-side and demand-side goals, Unger insists on certain macroeconomic necessities. First, we must enlist finance in the service of the real economy. Currently, most production and innovation is funded through the retained earnings of firms. Apple sells computers, makes money from the sales, and uses some of that money for production and innovation. Rarely does money invested in companies via the stock market service real production. Rather, finance services itself, spinning money around the financial industry. To Unger, finance can be a good servant, but a bad master. Thus, we need incentives for investments to be used in production instead of on the financial markets. More investors should resemble venture capitalists instead of stock market financiers. Second, governments should have a higher tax take and be willing to achieve it even at the cost of some regressive, transaction-oriented taxation of consumption. A value-added tax, which is like a sales tax for every step along the supply chain, could raise the tax take significantly. To Unger, we shouldn't worry about its regressiveness, for the output from the government that came with the higher tax take would disproportionately help the poor. Why do we need a higher tax take? Because, to Unger, there should be a fuller mobilization of national resources, what Unger calls a war economy without a war. Third, Unger insists on a higher level of domestic savings. Domestic savings can be channeled into innovative productive activity, gives a nation the freedom to not be beholden to those from which they borrow money, and prevents the debt-driven narcotic of overconsumption. Finally, we need to impose capitalism on the capitalists by untying sweetheart deals between big business and government. In addition to nation-specific supply-side, demand-side, and macroeconomic proposals, Unger also lays out a framework for redirecting globalization, so there is growth with inclusion. Unger argues that we have learned two major lessons from the globalization of the past decades. First, countries grow when they free markets. Second, those that have grown most are the least obedient to the formula that has been pressed upon them by the governments, financiers, and academics of the rich countries. The most successful developing countries have been innovative with their institutions. To Unger, the most successful countries say, markets and globalization, yes, but on our own terms. Given these lessons, what should developing nations do? Unger urges them to raise a shield of heresy, policies that enable themselves to turn to markets and to globalization on their own terms. This will allow them to have the leeway to make socially inclusive growth feasible. To aid in this process, the global trading regime's reigning principles should be revised. First, the global trading regime should cease having the maximization of free trade be its commanding goal, and instead should facilitate the coexistence of alternative development trajectories and experiences of civilization, as long as they are democratic. Second, the regime should stop organizing world trade on the basis of a particular dogmatic view of how a market economy should be organized, the popular Western form of private property, private contract, and laissez-faire government, and instead refuse to incorporate into the global trade regime the assumptions of any particular variant of the market economy, save such assumptions as may result from basic human rights. Third, the regime should adjust its understanding of what the idea of a free world economy means. For example, why is capital allowed to roam but labor is not? Unger asks, insisting that capital and labor should have freedom to cross national frontiers. A nation should not be defined by generational succession, but institutional and moral distinction, shared engagement in building a shared future. Fourth, we should redirect the multilateral organizations like the World Bank and IMF so that their chief role is supporting the emergence of difference. They should be minimalist. The IMF should help balance of payments crises and keep the world economy open, but they should not impose uniformity. They should also serve pluralism by being pluralist themselves, breaking up into multiple organizations accommodating rival teams with different strategies and agendas. Finally, developing nations should contain the American ascendance. The regime of relations between nations should first promote national self-determination and human rights, and second, promote a plurality of centers of power through understandings among states. To achieve this, Unger argues that an entente of other countries should acknowledge U.S. supremacy without legitimizing it, and that when the U.S. crosses the line, the entente should become closer, circumscribing the U.S. and making it want to pull back. To summarize Unger's economic proposals, we should not be afraid to tinker with the actual institutions of the economy. In doing so, we should aim for innovation-friendly cooperation, as well as moving past wage labor and towards a regime of self-employment and cooperation. We should intervene on the supply side of the economy by broadening access to productive resources, spreading vanguard practices to more areas of the economy, and having the state coordinate with the market to ensure more markets in more diverse forms. We should intervene on the demand side of the economy by ensuring a higher take for labor and national prosperity, protecting the unorganized sectors of the economy, and subsidizing the skilling of unskilled workers. We should intervene in macroeconomics to enlist the financial sector to support production in the real economy, ensure a higher tax take and mobilize national resources more fully with that tax take, a war economy without a war, promote higher levels of domestic savings, and impose capitalism on the capitalists by ending sweetheart deals between big business and government. Finally, we should intervene in the globalization regime to allow nations to engage with globalization and markets on their own terms by containing American hegemony and ensuring that the global trading regime and multilateral organizations promote difference as opposed to uniformity. Unger couples these proposals to democratize the market with a robust program for deepening democracy. To Unger, democracy is not just about self-government and its balance with individual rights. It is also about the permanent creation of the new. To deepen democracy, Unger insists, we must marry institutional experimentation with the goal of making our lives bigger, so as to enhance our ordinary powers, enlarge the scope of our ordinary sympathies and ambitions, and render more intense our ordinary experience. This necessitates a hot and mobilized politics, and thus a sustained and organized heightening of the level of civic engagement. And as our politics heats up, our institutions must be flexible and responsive enough to channel our energies productively. So how does Unger propose we achieve this? To start, Unger proposes that we need to expand national social solidarity beyond money transfers facilitated by the government, such as welfare, and towards direct responsibility of people for one another. Currently, social solidarity consists of checks through the mail. Resources flow through the hands of the state, from people making money in the productive economy to people needing and spending money in the caring economy. But checks are not enough to bind us together. Thus, Unger proposes that every able-bodied adult should have a position in both the productive system and the caring economy. Part of working life should be like it is now, but another part of working life should be devoted to participating in the provision of care for the young, the old, the infirm, the poor, and the desperate. This will take each citizen beyond the boundaries of the family, providing deep social solidarity. To Unger, a major role of civil society should be to coordinate the caring economy. In taking this on, civic life needs to be provided fiscal and legal support. First, we must fund civic life better. There needs to be a higher fiscal basis for voluntary action. Foundations should not simply be hobby horses of the rich. There should be public foundations, independent of governmental influence, and managed by people representative of different currents of opinion. Second, there needs to be a new regime of law, civil society law, that contract and corporate law do not currently address. This law should incite the self-organization of civic life, outside both government and business, for the purpose of fulfilling the responsibilities of the caring economy. What then should be done with our current model of providing social services? To Unger, the current bureaucratic model of government services is too rigid and hierarchical. His proposal is that the state should only provide the services that are too difficult, too expensive, or too new to be provided by private providers. But Unger is not a let the market decide privatization advocate. He insists that the non-governmental providers of social services should be more than just businesses. They should be whatever organizations or teams may emerge to do the work. The government's job should be to provoke and nourish these teams, while acting as the social service vanguard, developing experimentally new services and new ways of providing old services. As Unger puts it, social services should not be bureaucratic imposition nor consumer choice, but rather experimental diversification on the basis of a loose set of associations between government and non-governmental initiatives. Binding the nation together through this deeper understanding of social solidarity is not enough, though, to deepen democracy. Unger asserts that we must also heat up formal politics, raise the temperature of democratic life, and quicken the pace of political change. By doing this, we can do the work of crisis without crisis. Unger proposes 5 ways we can go about heating up politics. First, we need constitutional arrangements that break deadlocks between the political branches of government. There should be systems of rapid resolution of impasse among branches, even if it takes involving the electorate in such resolutions. In America, we often praise the Constitution for slowing down politics. To Unger, this is a shame. The Constitution should quicken politics, not slow it down. Second, we should have more opportunities for experimental deviation in particular places and sectors. As society goes down a path, Unger writes, it should allow certain areas to go down another path so to hedge its bets. Locales should be able to opt out and try something different for a period. We should reconcile decisive choices in national politics with governmental innovations that allow for deviations and dissents. For example, if the nation decides on a way national roads should be designed, a few locales should be able to opt out for a period to test an alternative design. If the government decides on a way all departments must be run, a few departments should be allowed to try a different system. Third, there should be exclusively public financing of electoral campaigns and the banning of all use of private resources in elections. This will ensure the public trust necessary for continued participation. Fourth, there should be arrangements favoring a heightened, sustained, and organized level of popular engagement in politics. For example, parties and social movements should have free access to mass communication. Also, decision-making should combine features of representative and direct democracy. Finally, we should rescue people from circumstances of entrenched disadvantage or exclusion. Remedially, there should be an agency of the state tasked with intervening in institutions that have become little citadels of despotism and exclusion. Affirmatively, we must assure every citizen a basic stake in resources as soon as the wealth of society allows. This can be achieved through guaranteed income or a similar system. These 5 reforms would make great strides in heating up politics. To summarize Unger's proposals for deepening democracy, we should deepen social solidarity beyond simply taxes and transfers. To achieve this, we need to all share in the caring economy. The caring economy should be supported financially and legally, and the state should help encourage, coordinate, and innovate on the caring economy's provision of social services. We also need to heat up politics. We need a constitution that allows for faster politics, national projects with room for deviation, the public financing of elections, institutions that support a heightened level of political engagement, and help for the extremely disadvantaged and excluded. To Unger, democratizing the market economy and deepening democracy is not enough, though. We also need to equip the individual, both economically and educationally. Unger writes that we must equip and empower people in such a way that the way they receive education and economic equipment leaves them open to the greatest range of social and economic life. With regard to economic equipment, Unger argues that there should exist a social inheritance that ensures that each individual is given a minimum basic stake in resources on which she can draw at turning points in her life. Unger also puts forth an elaborate educational program. He argues that public education should be available throughout all of working life, insisting that people must be able to go back to school periodically, and that the financing and staffing of schools must remain uninfluenced by the unequal resources available to different localities. Unger does not just address the logistics of administering education, he also dives deep into the content and pedagogy of schooling. He argues that education should be less about the encyclopedic transfer of facts and the mastery of job-specific skills, and more about building generic conceptual and practical capabilities in students. Unger calls it moving from education based on content to education based on mastery. Unger explains that mastery enables the individual to move from job to job and to participate in 21st century forms of production, which rely less on deploying previously learned static skills and more on collective learning and permanent innovation. Education to Unger should be analytic, dialectic, and cooperative to free the mind and prepare individuals for participation in an experimentalist culture. It should be analytical and problematic rather than informational. It should prefer deepening understanding of selective topics rather than encyclopedic coverage. It should encourage cooperation rather than isolation under authoritarianism in teaching and learning. It should explore contrasting methods and views rather than appealing to a closed canon of the correct doctrine. And it should develop the skills and habits of perpetual piecemeal experimentation. To summarize Unger's proposals for equipping the individual, first, we must provide economic equipment to each individual, which can be achieved through a social inheritance. Second, we must also provide educational equipment to each individual by providing lifelong education and ensuring that there's no disparity between locales. This education should provide generic conceptual skills and train us for participation in an experimentalist culture. Thus far, Unger has identified a new foundational aim for the left: bigness, not equality, as well as a new program for the left: democratizing the market, deepening democracy, and equipping the individual. But this is not enough. The left needs an agent. Unger has identified two. The first agent that Unger identifies for the left is the petty bourgeoisie, which is the term Unger uses for small business owners, artisans, merchants, and dreamers with ideas. They are employers, but they often work alongside their employees. They have a culture of initiative and self-help. They study at night, and they own small, aspirational family businesses. They are people who, in Unger's words, make a self by struggling against their context. Unger argues that the left made a strategic mistake when it made such people the enemy. They were thought of as selfish copycats of the corporate vandals the left opposed. But in fact, they are the dreamers we should support. We are, as Unger puts it, in large numbers, petty bourgeoisie now, by imaginative orientation, if not by economic fact. A second agent for the left is what Unger calls nations wanting to be different. To Unger, a nation is a chance at difference, a form of moral specialization within humanity. The left should support nations that want to turn democratic polities, market economies, and free civil societies into machines for developing distinct and novel forms of life. In turn, such nations will support the left. To recap, Unger has a new program for the left. We should substitute in bigness for just greater equality as the left's foundational aim. In doing this, we should democratize the market, substituting interventions in the market's institutions for after-the-fact redistribution of wealth. Such interventions' aims should be innovation-friendly cooperation and moving past wage labor and towards self-employment and cooperation. This can be achieved by broadening access to productive resources, spreading the flexible practices of the most cutting-edge firms to more parts of the economy, and using the government to generate more types of markets organized in more types of ways. We should also deepen democracy, remembering that democracy need not just be a mechanical balance between self-government, competing interests, and individual liberties, but also a source of the permanent creation of the new. To deepen democracy, we need deeper social solidarity, supplementing tax and transfer welfare checks with direct care for one another in a caring economy. With this deeper solidarity, we must heat up politics, quickening political processes and promoting widespread political participation. Finally, we need to equip the individual with basic economic resources and access to lifelong education that builds skills to participate in our experimental culture. Now that we understand Unger's political program, we turn to part 5 to understand how Unger thinks about what he is proposing and how that way of thinking can lead us towards actually realizing the Ungarian project in the world.